All right. As you're coming in, feel free to drop in your location. There's a great geographic diversity in all these conversations, and this one's no different. Um, all right, this is a real treat. Excited about this conversation. Kerra and I have several. Kerra and I have several things in common. One is that we're both have done a lot of work in congregations. She's in Virginia now, but she's done a lot of work. She's ordained in the Presbyterian Church. So we have that in common. And the thing that brings us together in this moment is that we were both participants in the Hopkins NYU Religious Professional Study many moons ago, and that was released. Was released last Friday, and lots of press coming out about that now too. So that's on it. That's in an email. We'll keep talking about that, but lots of good resources out there. And one of the resources that's emerging as we speak is Kerra's book, True Awakening, and it's going to, I think, be an important part of the conversation. And she and I were just saying, marveling at how perfect the timing is actually for that book to be coming out. So Kerra is a clergy person in the Presbyterian Church, as I mentioned, and is also a spiritual director, and was a part of, like I said, part of the study. And she's been writing a book, and it's coming out in a couple weeks. Although I think it's even available right now on from a Cokesbury, I think, the Methodist Publishing House.
Yep. If you order from Cokesbury, you can get it a little quicker, I think, but it's available on a lot of different formats. Yeah.
Okay, good. Okay, good. So, Kerra, as we're getting started, and this is going to be a conversation. This is not just two talking heads. It's going to be a conversation, and but I think it'd be good for Kerra to locate herself in the conversation, and then she and I have some things we're going to talk about, and then we're going to open it up to the larger group. So, let Kerra go ahead and tell us about you and your work and how you found yourself here.
Yep, I think Hunt gave a good introduction. I've been a Presbyterian pastor for quite some time, since the late 90s now, so that seems so long ago. But I've served churches in Pennsylvania and Tennessee and in the Richmond, Virginia area. So I've been in church ministry for a long time, especially as the preaching pastor. So I've given a lot of sermons. I'm a spiritual director with Ligare, and also I do some freelance spiritual direction, and I'm associated with Richmond Hill in Richmond, Virginia, as one of their adjunct directors. Um, like Hunt, I answered an ad to go and have a journey at Johns Hopkins. So I teased that it was the Facebook algorithm that put it in my line of sight, and it was an exciting adventure, and it was also challenging and um, and meaningful. If you read in the study, there was one participant who had enough the first go around to not take the second go around. That was me. It just felt like I had such a powerful experience that a month later I wasn't done processing the first one enough to go a second time. So that's my experience with the study. And in my ministry, I was at a point of some, transition vocationally, and took a class on Teresa of Avila's Interior Castle with the Center for Action and Contemplation. James Finley and Mirabai Starr were the two presenters for that. It was all online, but part of hearing that class and being at a transition and having had some of these experiences, I think the book kind of came together in a revelation to begin with, but then it was the work it took to actually get it written down.
Yeah, go ahead, Kerra. That was just some background noise.
Oh yeah, that's fine.
Yeah. So what was the last thing you said just about the
just that taking that class at a transition time was I think what inspired the revelation for the book. And then the hard part was actually like sitting down and outlining chapters and having to get it on paper. So what starts with this is what I think I need to do, or where the inspiration or the muse comes from, then it takes a while to get it all put together in a form that other people can understand.
Yeah, good. Well, yeah, that's so. Speaking of the book, and I do want to definitely spend a good deal of time. Someone's, yeah, if we could all mute, that'd probably be good because there's a little bit of feedback coming in. So speaking of the book, tell us a little bit, tell us about the title, which is True Awakening. I don't have the actual book. I've just got a mock-up of it. The highs, lows, and mess of spiritual transformation.
Well, it's interesting because that was not my original working title. When I had the experience at Johns Hopkins, they asked the participants to write a report afterwards, and my report at Johns Hopkins, the title was "Awakenings Suck," and which is actually the first sentence in the book, but Orbis wouldn't let me call it that. So as we started looking at other things, because it wasn't just about the challenges of awakening, it was also about the good things about awakening and the positive attributes that come from it. And so in working with my editor, she talked about this idea of highs, lows, and mess, that it's not a straightforward kind of journey to seek spiritual transformation. And so that was sort of her contribution. And as we started playing with the word awakening more, I said we really need to think about what's true, because you could have kind of a spiritual experience or a what you think is a powerful experience, but if it doesn't ring true, it's not going to lead you towards that kind of churning that gets you to the point of spiritual transformation. So even though it's not a linear process, I think there are some things that can be talked about in terms of here are some, sort of hand and footholds to help you climb this mountain that's called spiritual transformation.
Yeah. I meant to say this at the beginning. I think I love everything about the book. And here's the two things I love the most about it. One is you do an amazing job of bringing you mentioned Teresa of Avila, but you bring in kind of the historic Christian, the tradition within the history of Christianity for mystical experiences and awakenings. You bring that, the history of that in, and you also integrate popular culture, which you do a really good job of doing that too. And I think that Awakening Suck as a working title, you do a really good job of bringing in a bit of irreverence and lightheartedness and to a serious matter. And I think integrating both the tradition and the current moment and the pop culture, which is where a lot of us get our sense of who we are and where we are through popular culture. You did a great job with that. And the other thing is decentering psychedelics as decentering psychedelics and saying this is in the context of a larger set of concerns, which is a spiritual path, which is getting out of our spiritual and religious ruts, getting out of our psychological ruts, and how spirituality, religion, practice can do that. And one of the ways is through psychedelics, which we'll talk about in a minute. But I think just sort of making psychedelics not the focus of it, but as part of the bigger story, which is, I think, part of how you came to this is having that experience and then seeing where the connections were. So you did that was really, really well done. And it's easy to read and it's fun to read. And I hear your voice in it, which is always a good time. What do you say when you talk as a spiritual director or clergy person, or now as an author? How do you talk about and think about the whole concept of spiritual awakening? How do you figure that in?
I think it really is that place where we find ourselves challenged to think in a new way um, about something that's spiritual or meaningful to us. So it's waking up to new knowledge, but the integration of that knowledge has to happen too. So like you mentioned about the psychedelics part, for me, that's under the, sort of under the umbrella spiritual heading of letting go or surrender. If you can do something that's challenging and difficult, walking the Camino, doing doing a psychedelic. My example I use in the book is, jumping out of an airplane with a parachute on your back. Any of those things might give you kind of that experience that makes you rethink things, but then it's sort of what do you do with that helps you continue to wake up. And for example, I was willing to do psychedelics. I am not jumping out of an airplane. That might be somebody else's way to enlightenment, but everybody's, which means everybody does need to find their own path. And which means that psychedelics might be for some people a path that makes a lot of sense. But for others, it might not, and they might need to walk the Camino or climb a mountain or, you know, take a long silent retreat, whatever that is that kind of puts you in a little bit of an uncomfortable space so that you can see things in a new way. Or sometimes it's the opening of, you're startled by something that wakes you up, that sort of natural spiritual occurrence of being in nature or, birth of a child, something happens momentous that puts you into that space.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. That's good. As I mentioned, one of the things you and I have in common is we've done a lot of work in congregations, both, I think for both of us, lifelong kind of, at least for me, a lifelong participation in Christian congregations, and then also then leading them. And what do you see as, stepping back just a little bit from the big topics of spiritual awakening to kind of on the ground, kind of how people, most of us, practice our religions. What do you think are the challenges and the blessings of congregational ministry, congregational life, leadership, kind of life in a congregation? What are from your experience, what are the blessings and challenges of that as a container to use psychedelics?
Yeah, I found a chapter title in one of M.K. Backstrom's books really enlightening here. She writes sort of in the mom and reflections on church space, and one of her chapter titles is "Welcome to Church. We're all weird here," and I think that that's both kind of the blessing and the curse of church, is that you do enter into a community where people are going to be very different from you, in a variety of ways. And they may have some similarities too, but you're trying to accomplish some things together or understand some things in similar ways and be guided by text and tradition, but also by relationship with other people. And I think that those relationships really are kind of that rock tumbler. I've heard it said that way too, about the kind of community life of, you kind of get the sharp edges off when you actually have to see each other week in and week out and have some kind of relationship where Jesus told you not to be a jerk to other people, and and so so you're managing that in church life as a pastor. It really is kind of tending that space, and welcoming people's strangenesses, as a way of learning new things about humanity. I often, the thing I would have been if I had not become a pastor was I really wanted to be Jane Goodall, and there's kind of that observations of other species and what they do to be in community, but kind of I realized as a pastor I'm just sort of I try to see myself as the Jane Goodall of church relationships of what do I observe, how can I be engaged with this in a way, because I'm a participant too, right, not just the outside observer. So church life is like that. It's meaningful and it's crazy and
It's hard.
it's hard. It's sometimes the best thing, and it's sometimes the most horrible thing. If people are, you'll get into that space of mean girl stuff or, just antagonistic. It can feel an extra layer of hurt because it should be surrounded by the love of God, and sometimes it doesn't feel that way.
Yeah, one of the things that I think any of us that get into that work and leadership in churches, because we've had multiple experiences of God, and
Mhm.
in church, outside church, and it's changed us, and it's changed us enough that we'll leave whatever we're doing to do this work for the people that are doing it in an authentic way. And I think I'll just speak personally and be interested in what you think about it. Church woke me up in lots of ways as a younger person, as an adult. And I realized after I got into it as a profession and vocation and job that many people didn't see that as part of what should happen at church, or a lot of that church the transformation or change, or really just being honest about. I used to say, what would it be like if when we walked here on Sunday morning, we actually told people how we actually were doing? Like, instead of just saying, "Oh, I'm fine," it's like, "Well, my husband's drinking too much, and we're about to get a divorce, or the kids are doing this or that," and everyone puts on their best face and comes into church. A lot of, not everybody, but on it, and so, uh, it, and that's maybe where once I've had that psychedelic experience to say, "Oh my God, this has the potential to do what I've been trying to with people in a way that I've been trying to do it, and with mixed, very little success actually in some ways, using liturgy or gathering or to kind of wake people up spiritually and to be realize they're on a spiritual path, and there's legitimate questions and doubt, and we can evolve in our spiritual lives. It's not just stuck in kind of 14-year-old confirmation class. And it's not it's in some ways it's a critique it's not a critique of the people so much as is a critique of how we think about church life. I don't know if that resonates with you at all, but
It does, and I think it's a spectrum. Like, in every church that I've served, I've met a couple of those people who are ready for transformation. Um, and have really made, just dug in because they really wanted to grow in their relationship with God. And then you have those who are just kind of cruising along. Well, I want my kids to have a good sense of morality, or I like to hear Bible stories, or it, for the most part, it means something for me to sing in the choir. I mean, how many choir people are like, I'm here because I can sing. One of my churches had an atheist who came because he wanted to sing music in 4-part harmony. I mean, he was there because of that.
Mhm.
So you get people who are there for a variety of reasons, but the ones who actually like put the work in and transform, like, and you get to be a part of that as their pastor. It's stunning. There's a gentleman in one of my congregations who you know had been in, basically in the Republican Party for many years, business guy, genuinely good guy, had watched a good bit of Fox News and then started listening to sermons, and he was very much a faithful person. We talked a lot about ethics, and we talked a lot about morality, and we talked a lot about leadership because he's just a keen person on those things. And and we didn't hold each other's political opinions against each other in that time frame when things weren't quite as crazy as they are now. But after you know I've since left that church, but he had an he had an experience recently of having eye surgery and then headaches that followed after it, and he started writing poetry, and he said, I need to share with you some of the poems that I'm writing. So I mean, you but it takes like 10 years of walking with somebody, 12 years of walking with somebody to get to that point where you're in that kind of relationship where they can tell you what's really going on with them. And so the idea of longevity in a church, my family's been, except for me because I left and moved on to other pastoral things, has been in the same church at least 5 generations. So those kinds of deep relationships are pretty unique in our world right now when you see them happen.
yeah. The thing about singing, I've heard people say, I've heard the reflection that church and maybe a baseball game are the only places that people actually can. I mean, in baseball, it's like at the seventh inning, but there's very few places in the world where people can come together and sing.
Yeah.
And that is not insignificant.
Yeah.
That is not insignificant, because that's I would say that is a spiritual practice. And so,
Mhm.
yeah. So your atheist friend, like, that's just good. I'm glad he found
Yep.
it. And I would also say, just about the kind of open to transformation, that includes a lot of clergy. And I would say that that's in certain times in my life that there is an ordained person. I just didn't have any more bandwidth except for what I was doing. So to cut people some slack, it's like having a family, having more than a full-time job, and just your own stuff in your life, sometimes. So clergy are, it's not like you get some special pass because we went to seminary and got ordained. There's a lot of clergy are stuck too. And I think one of the things that we got out of our study, I think, is getting unstuck. I mean, I know I did.
Yeah,
But we had to
I
still,
think the idea that the study might have addressed clergy burnout is real.
yeah,
That it could be a way of, that inspiration that sent you on a quest and a calling, um, can wear thin after you're at it for a while. So what does it take to, sort of get a booster of that?
yeah,
Um,
exactly. Yeah, everybody needs a boost. And
yeah.
so, and I think we hear the word deconstruction a lot in evangelical circles, like the ex-evangelicals, or
Mhm.
I think in the main line and maybe in the Catholic world, people just stop coming. I don't think there's any big dramatic thing that happens, but I think people just stop coming. But the deconstruction, I would say, I think is equally as part of the spiritual life as construction. And I would say if we're evolving, we're in this cycle of deconstruction and construction, and that's it's not just an evangelical matter or experience. I think it should be all of us. And I'm wondering for you, what you've had to deconstruct in your life in the Christian community. What part of your own are there some examples in your own life that you've had to put stuff aside or realize, oh, that actually is not what I think anymore? Or
I think I hope that my perception of God continues to grow and change and not just be completely static, because we can never completely describe the mystery that is the divine. So, um, coming out of seminary, you get really deep into your own tradition, and you come out of it like really super Presbyterian. Like, here I am. I know all that the Book of Order has to say. I know what the tradition's supposed to teach. I know how I'm supposed to do communion and not supposed to do communion, because if I say it the wrong way on the test, then I won't get ordained. And those kinds of things. You sort of have that. This is the direction, and then you meet up against people who say, "Well, I think this predestination stuff is a load of shit," and you're like, "Oh God, maybe it is."
yeah, that's maybe a particularly Presbyterian issue.
Right.
Yeah,
So you start asking those questions of, okay, is there something more, and is there something more? And so that was happening. I actually started my ministry at the height of the HIV um epidemic. And there was a family in the congregation, their son had died of AIDS, and she was a nurse, and she taught me things about being pastoral that I didn't know that I needed to know. And she was the one who said, "Okay, we've got somebody who's dying in the church. Do you need somebody to go with you the first time to help you know how to?" I'm like, "Yeah," because I was 26 and I hadn't walked into a room where somebody was dying before.
yeah,
So those kinds of things, and it's learning, but it's also unlearning of, you know it's not just about the academics, it's about the relationships. And then and that keeps getting reaffirmed and reaffirmed. And then then you meet people of other religious traditions that you hadn't spent as much time with, because you're in community now with the rabbi, or the Catholic priest, or somebody who's does things differently than you. And 9/11 happens, and you need to figure out how are you going to talk about that together as a community. So all those things um, should rightly challenge your faith, because if I still stayed stuck in that old way, it wasn't going to do me any good. And it's the idea, and I know I've heard Bill Richards say this, and probably others too. um, when somebody says I don't believe in God, usually that's the same God I don't believe in, the one who's smiting people and telling people they're going to go to hell. That's not the God I want to believe in. So letting those you know old tapes, whether they're from culture or from something I actually believed, go, gives us a deeper perception of who we are, and leads to that kind of spiritual transformation where you can be more compassionate and more caring for others.
Yeah, that's good. I remember when I was in seminary, of course, they fill up your library. That's part of what they're doing. You spend a lot of money on books, at least back when people had a lot of books. And I remember one of my professors saying, don't in 25 years, don't let these be the only books on your shelf that, that, which is to say, your theology and your practice needs to be evolving all the time, not stuck in some particular moment in time when you were formed as a clergy person or as a Christian, really. That's back to not for those of us to not being stuck in a kind of teenage confirmation sort of theology. And that's just think that's just a healthy, it is the only, I think it's the way, it's the only way. We're constantly evolving. Well, I definitely want to spend some time talking about your experience in the study, and then we're going to break up into a couple groups so people can get a chance to talk and share, and then we'll come back together before we close. But one of the ways you talked about the study in the book was that it was a bullet train to the interior journey, a crash course in spiritual awakening. And I just want to get some particulars, some specifics from you about that.
Yeah, I think afterwards I had heard Roland Griffiths describe it in a similar way. And, because it's, it, for me, it was like once you're on that roller coaster, you're going up, you're going up and you're on it. And, and I don't particularly like roller coasters. And I'm like, oh, what did I do? So, and there, it's not like the kind of, distraction like in meditation. If you start thinking a certain direction and the other part of your brain goes, stop it over here, you kind of can. With psychedelics you really can't. When you're on the journey, you're on the journey until you see what all happens. And especially with the kind of doses we were given at Johns Hopkins, um, that's how it was going to be. And that's what I experienced. And I yeah, I had that sort of, oh, I'm on this ride. Okay.
There's no getting off. There's no
Right.
getting That's good. Um, One of the things that's talked a lot about in psychedelic, both in the research and just in the practical application, in some cases it's lip service, unfortunately, but I think it's an important part of this. And I've got my own thoughts on this, but so we talk a lot about preparation and integration. So preparation, obviously, before the experience. And I'm wondering, in your own experience, what do you think were the ways that you were prepared, because you didn't know until you responded to that and then got accepted for the study that you were going to be in a psychedelic study and have that experience. But upon reflection, I'm wondering how you think, what was the prep for you, aside from what they did at Hopkins, which was really good, but a lot of that was just helping us feel comfortable and at ease. But there was no spiritual preparation there. So I'm wondering how you felt like you'd prepared for the experience, unbeknownst to what you were about to do or at some point do.
Yeah, it was my oldest child's first year of college, and Cade was taking two classes. One was called Native American Spirituality, and one was called Drugs in the Brain. He was doing like chemistry and religion, and and we were talking a lot about those classes. I'm like, "Oh, freshman year, and you got good classes. That's the joys of a small liberal arts college, And and the idea of a spiritual depth that's tied to nature, and learning about drugs in a way that was like, you know, not the DARE program of just don't do it,
Right.
but to really look at what are the things that are happening in the brain, and with psychedelics, with you know drugs for anxiety and depression. That we were having those conversations, and I think that was, I asked him, do you think I should sign up for this study? And um, he was encouraging in a way of, this isn't addictive in the way you're thinking about some drugs. This isn't, if you're going to have an experience that's spiritual, you might want to think about it. So I think that was the odd thing that made me pay attention when the ad came up of, maybe this is something I need to consider in terms of listening for what my next step in going deeper is.
Yeah, good. Well, I realized pretty early on, upon reflection, pretty immediately after that, probably the next day, was that my own spiritual, I mean, I think my theological training and, sort of
Mhm,
my, all the things I'd done in my life spiritually, but I think spiritual direction, I'd been in spiritual direction at that time, maybe 15 years.
mhm.
And I think I know that really, in many ways, tilled the soil. So not everyone's familiar with spiritual direction because you are one, because you're also a pastor. I'd like for you to just say a little bit about spiritual direction and how you feel like that can be helpful for people.
Yeah, I think that was probably a preparation too, because I was, I had taken the classes, and I had become a spiritual director and was working through some of those things. And the thing that I love about spiritual direction is that it takes seriously each person's spiritual journey. And that's something that the church doesn't do in quite the same way. Because if you're in a church, you're kind of you're in this tradition, and even if the boundaries are pretty open space, you're still kind of putting people in this, yeah, well, we're all going to do this together, and we're all going to use this same sacred text, and we're going to think about it in these certain ways, or look to these certain speakers or prayers to speak to it. But in spiritual direction, it's really what's your personal relationship with God, and how are you working that out? um, and it's just meeting with someone who can help you have those conversations. And even though the word director is in the title, it's not nearly as directive as that. It's more like accompanying somebody on the journey, or being a companion and saying, um, you know your relationship with God is unique and fascinating, and God cares about it, and you matter. And so I think having that kind of relationship, even with another person who says what you understand spiritually to be true is something that I'm concerned about, is very affirming. I mean, I think that's part of the spiritual direction process.
Yeah, I think it's not a critique of the pastor, the role of pastor. I mean, it's like in church, we're really putting a lot of people through a fairly set, to your point, process. And it, that's really helpful, and it's formative. And we all have our own life experiences that can't always be accommodated or examined in a congregational setting. And soul friend is another spiritual
Hmm.
companion. Soul friend is
Yeah.
and it's an ancient ministry, and I think it's only in the last 30 or 40 years come back into, it
Hmm.
goes back to early Christianity,
Yeah.
and it's only come back into awareness. And across a broad range, the Catholic monasteries and convents held that for a long time, and then people started rediscovering it. And then now in evangelical circles and all kinds of mainline traditions, it's lifted up, and yet there's still a lot of just not awareness about it. And there's an organization called Spiritual Directors International that Kerra certainly knows about, but it's an international organization. It's kind of a professional organization,
Hmm.
and they just met for their annual conference last week, and for the first time they had a whole kind of unit on psychedelics and spirituality, which was, I think, just a sign of affirmation of what we're all doing and talking about and thinking about around this call. It's an affirmation of the importance of this in people's spiritual lives, and people are doing it, and the church and the kind of ministries connected to it really need to wake up to it and to
Sure. Sure.
be present to people and help them. So I am going to break us up into a couple groups in just a minute. So in the book, in the chapter on your psychedelic experiences, you list 8 or 9 different topics and or kind of areas that really resonated with you or that connected to you. And there's 2 of them that I wanted just for you to say a little bit about, and then we'll break up. One is embodiment, and the other is tradition, and how you see how that impacted, or what you got from that out of your experience. Embodiment.
Yeah, I mean, it's no surprise that Presbyterians tend to be in their head a lot. We earn the name Frozen Chosen. And and psychedelics are very much, I mean, it's a body experience. I mean, and it's your whole body experience. There, it's how the music felt, not just how it was heard. Um, you know, how, there were times that felt like birthing, there were times that felt like dying, there were times that felt, uncomfortable. Like I said, these violins are hurting me. The kind of experiences that are difficult to describe when you come back to the real world and you're like, I know what that felt like, but I can't really easily describe it. Um, and I think we need to pay attention more to that as, as church people, and the heart associations too, the
Yeah.
emotions that were a part of the experience were very intense. So I think, all of those are body feelings. Um, and then tradition, I happen to go for my Johns Hopkins experience the week after Holy Week. So, the Lent, the end of Lent, Easter cycle week is a big week in churches for those of you. um, more services. You're thinking about the last few days of Jesus's life, and and those are sort of drawn out into a perspective, and that tradition played out in my psychedelic experience, and not just that I had connections to Jesus, because I did, both in, crucifixion and resurrection kind of moments, but I could see that as a pattern too of, the life and um, living and dying and being reaffirmed, reborn, resurrected, all those things that, happened. I had that spiral kind of happen to me throughout the experience, and it was repeated. Like I would have something that was really hard and challenging, and then experience this, blissful light and overcoming of a sense of wonder and joy and connection. And then like some really difficult thing would start it all over again. And so it felt like it affirmed that um Christian tradition cycle, that pattern, in my own understanding and upbringing. Richard Rohr talks about that a lot, that there's a pattern to life that's the same pattern in Christianity. The 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 cycle of regeneration of life, biologically, ecologically, all of it seems to make sense together, and that it affirmed that for me.
Yeah. Well, I think he has a really, I mean, there's life, death, and resurrection, which would be a very kind of not just Christian. That's one of the ways you think about it. And the other way he talks about it is order, disorder, reorder.
Reorder, yes, yes.
And that I think that really can apply to anything, but it certainly can apply to experiences people are having psychedelics, where everything comes apart and then you put it back together, or it can. Yeah. Well, I'm conscious. I'm gonna split us up into two groups so we can just have a. One question to take into this conversation is what's in the last 40 minutes that we've been talking and listening. Well, you all been listening. Karen and I've been talking, but in this discussion, what's come up? What's coming up for, if anything, what's coming up for you? We can share that in our two breakout rooms, and I'll pull us back together in about, we'll see how it goes, but maybe 15 minutes, so we can.
Hunt, there's some questions in the chat too that I haven't been able to follow. So if you
yeah,
were to
well,
pull some of those into the groups or at the end, I'm happy to take some questions too.
Well, I'll tell you what, let's do that now, and then let me see.
And I've been talking, I haven't been able to catch up with it, so.
Yeah, neither. It's hard. Well, I tell you, so I do. Let's take for the people that chat, put something in the chat room. Why don't you raise your hand or just unmute and ask a question or make a comment? I wasn't keeping track of the chat, so yeah, maybe two people, then we'll break up. Anybody that had popped, especially anybody that put something in the chat, if you want to pop in and.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So my name is Robert Wallace. I'm a preacher's kid, missionary kid, grew up on the mission field, and was in an evangelical space for most of my life. And I think, like a lot of people, no one changes unless the change of staying the same is greater than the pain of change. And that certainly was the case for me. So I had I won't go into it now because but there were a number of crises in my 50s that really made me reevaluate what I believed. And in the process, one of my daughters, is the one who introduced me to psychedelics, and I did my first and have done a couple psilocybin journeys with her. And one of the things that we are doing as a family, and I feel quite privileged in this regard, is we are deconstructing as a family. And
Oh,
so
wow.
there is a certain amount of healing that's going on in our family that is, it's really, I feel quite privileged. So one of the reasons I've came to this conversation, and the reason I found I forget how I first connected to Ligare. I think it must have been on Substack, but I still believe in the principle of community, and I also have always believed in the goodness of meeting together with people who are very unlike you. Um, and now, happily, that can happen in families as well. But I'm still not convinced that I want to or need to go back into a formal church setting.
Mhm.
My wife and I have been visiting. I travel a lot, but we're visiting a Roman Catholic church, an African American Roman Catholic church, and I like it. But there's still a lot of things about just the language and of church and what I don't believe anymore about hell and God and whatever that I find I'm looking for reasons, I guess, to find to go back to church. But I'm really not convinced. So anyway,
Yeah.
that's some thoughts.
Kerra, did you want to respond? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you know, you kind of have to go into church not thinking it's going to solve everything, and and that's, and there have been times as a past, I don't know if you've seen the cartoon, but so the cartoon of, but you have to go to church, and it's somebody dragging their pastor spouse to church. You're the preacher, so there's definitely times when it feels better or not. And I think for people who've been hurt by church and are experiencing religious trauma, trying to force that is not, not helpful. And in fact, it can have the opposite effect of being really hurtful. So I think people have to figure out their own paths to that. And and in the book, I really try to very much say, here's some things that can be wonderful about church life, but you're not going to hell if you don't. Yeah, I mean and that's the unfortunate thing that people hear is, well, I really am damned if I don't. And I don't think that's what God wants. I mean, I really, if you think about the unity in God, and if you think about who you really want God to be, would God be the kind of God that's like, well, you know, you screwed up last Tuesday. I guess you're not going to heaven now. I mean, that's not who we want God to be. And
Sure, and for
yeah,
the record, I don't believe in that God either, and I wouldn't
yeah,
go to a church that's
right.
communicating that God from the pulpit. Um, but I don't know. I guess I just feel like it feels to me, and I could be wrong, but just my anecdotal experience seems to me that we are in a sea change culturally, and perhaps a turning point in terms of our Christian traditions, where maybe we are looking at new paradigms, like literally new paradigms. And I'm yeah, I don't have any illusions about church.
Yeah.
Church is people, right? And I only have to look into the mirror to realize I don't have any illusions about church. Um, but but I do, the idea of church, I guess, is so deeply ingrained in me, and and the idea of spiritual direction I've been very
Yeah.
open to, but it's very hard for me to think of having spiritual direction with someone who doesn't even share my language or experience.
Mhm.
That I mean, I've studied the Bible my whole life. I've got, a master's degree. I've done all that kind of stupid shit. and it doesn't, I don't have illusions about knowledge. But I do feel like there does have to be a common ground of language, of
Sure.
experience, even in a church setting. So I don't know what to do with that. I don't know what to do. I mean, the likelihood of walking into a church where the rector, priest, pastor is also doing journeys on the side is somewhat remote at this point. And
Yeah.
so I'm not exactly sure what to do with that, I guess.
And even if he or she is, they're not going to tell you about it. But and there are a lot. There are a good. You'd be surprised, but yeah, they're not going to talk about it. I think one of my pet projects is, I think this is pertinent to the work Ligare is doing and what Kerra's doing. But one of my not secret, one of my desires is that clergy and congregations will come to a place where there's an openness about the discussion, whether people do it or not, to be curious about, so that kind of how we did in the 90s and 2000s with open and affirming congregations for gay and lesbian people, that there'd be a sort of a network of congregations that would be open to, this is not doing psychedelics in the parish hall, but it's like a willingness to be curious. And like, even if there was a integration groups at churches, like that would be, I would feel like this work would have been, we could, if we could get to that point, Ligare could shut down because it would be so integrated into the church culture. That's
Wow,
going to,
that would be amazing. That would
that's,
be amazing.
and there really are a lot of, I mean, this is not just about clergy, because church is not about clergy, just too much about clergy in some cases. But I think a lot of people have gone to seminary because of a psychedelic experience. I talked to a lot of people that have had experiences, and it propelled their spiritual life so much that they decided to go that route. And there's a lot of curiosity and not enough, but there's a lot of curiosity with clergy. So some of it's just moving slow and resourcing people, but that's one of our missions, is to make this normalize the conversation in Christian community, I guess to say. So
And curiosity is a spiritual gift that we don't talk about nearly often enough. So if you're curious about a church and you try it and it's not the right fit, you get curious about the next one or the next spiritual director or the next experience. I think that could be, uh, that's sort of the way forward, as we learn new things, is to be curious and then try some creative things.
Yeah. Good. Well, please hang. I'm just gonna drop us into two chat rooms for just 10 minutes. I'll pull us back together, and we'll close up. Not too long after the top of the hour. But for those of you that have the time, please stay with us, and I'm gonna put us into two separate rooms, and we'll just get maybe a little more intimate conversation. So hang with us just a minute so I get that done, and I'll make sure Kara's in one and I'm in the other, and we'll come back together in about 10 minutes. And you'll be invited to join one of the rooms, I think. All right, everybody's coming back. It's always a little smaller after the breakout group, but just in these close, thank you all for hanging in and for the good comments, and at least in my group, I'm sure the other one too. I wonder if there's just, we have Kerra for a few more minutes, just to anybody had any questions for her or comments about the work she's doing or this conversation in general. Just open up the floor for maybe 5 minutes for Kerra. Questions? Kerra, while people are thinking, talk about how people can get usual places, I guess, but when is it out and how can people get a copy of it?
Both Amazon, Target, and Barnes and Noble have pre-order options if
Oh.
any of those suit your fancy. Cokesbury bookstores, for those of you who are in religious communities, it's sort of a religious warehouse of books, and it can be ordered through there. And then Orbis Books is the publisher, and they'll have it, I think, ready to order on the release date of June 25th. And my favorite bookseller, Thrift Books, where you can get cheap books, even has it. And I think you can get a couple bucks off.
Oh, okay, good.
It's the cheapest spot I've seen it.
Okay, good. Yeah. Any closing comments or questions for Kerra before we close out?
I have a question for Kerra. Remind me, if you will, please, what you said about people who are in the church or out of the church and they're deconstructing of their former beliefs and faiths. What did you say about that?
I kind of rambled for a while. I think that I think I don't want to put pressure on people to be in church when they're not ready for it. And I also think it's about growing in your own spirituality. If you're deconstructing and you're just like, you've never really been interested in church, that's not very painful because it's just something, that was never part of your life to begin with. But if it's been a big part of your life and you're trying to figure out what to do with that and it doesn't feel right anymore, I think having safe people to go through that exploration with, people that you trust, being curious about how other people think about things is important. For me, it's just really about growing in, who we understand God to be and who we understand ourselves to be.
Yeah, I'm thinking about that from the context of my own ministry about 25 years ago, halfway through my 50 years of being an Episcopal priest. I was standing at the end of a service at which I had been the celebrating preacher, and we were facing the West End and getting ready to go out, and a mystical experience came upon me, which I was able to be honest and to say, no longer am I going to give any more energy to upholding a crumbling orthodoxy. I'm not going to do that anymore.
Yeah. And it's hard when it's your vocation, like, oh shit, what do I do now? I mean, that's what happens to preachers who can't feel like they can step into the pulpit anymore. Oftentimes it's such a drastic change to go to anything else. Every once in a while we're like, well, we're looking for jobs, and what else could I do except ministry? I don't know. I mean, I still want to be in ministry, but when you find yourself in that place that you can't be, that's a challenge to identity. I mean, pastors especially absorb that role as an identity. And kind of letting that go with psychedelics is pretty profound too. I'm a person. I'm a human being. I'm connected with all other human beings. That's pretty big stuff.
Well, in our Episcopal liturgy, there's just so much in that I don't believe. And yet I do it. And how have I gotten to be at peace with that? Because it's not all about me.
Right. And we're there for other people. There's a balance between being there for ourselves and being there for other people. And yeah.
I had a wise congregation member tell me once, she said, my father used to say, if you're going to be Presbyterian, you should probably agree with about 75% of what the church does. But if you don't disagree the other 25%, you're not really Presbyterian.
I like that. I like that.
Oh, wow. Well, thank you. Thanks, Kara. First, thank you for being here, but also for your book. I know it's going to be is an important resource for people. Somebody said earlier, we're in a big sea change in every part of the culture, and religion is Christianity, and I assume other religions are experiencing that in deep and scary and discomforting ways. And I think for people to have resources like this can be extremely helpful. So thank you for your work. Thanks for all you for showing up and being part of this community. And please check out we're planning for the fall and offerings, but we're also doing a whole series of these sort of conversations. So please keep showing up and tell your friends and neighbors. Tell your pastor if you're not a pastor. So, if you so dare. Yeah. Yeah. All right. Well, thanks everyone. Thanks again, Kara. Thanks for all of you for showing up, and
Absolutely.
see you next time. Thanks.
Right.
Talk to
Thank
y'all
you.
later.
Take
Bye-bye.
care.
You too. Bye-bye.
All right.